Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
The Stoa is a place to cohere in dialogue around what matters most at the knife's edge of the moment. Don't touch that dial. For the next 60 minutes, you're going to enter an reality. Some people never come back. How's that? Okay, Vince Horn is coming in. See that? I told you he was coming. Yeah, so welcome, and nice to see some familiar faces and to welcome some new people. We could go a couple of different ways today, and I wish we had this polling feature. Isn't there a polling feature on Zoom now? Yeah, so we could revisit some of the questions that we populated a couple of weeks ago. But what I was trying to do is look at them as a whole. And I started having the impulse to move on to a series that we could build on around the question of what is the spirituality we need? Does that seem like it has energy for you? Yeah, so what do I mean by that? You know, we usually relate to spirituality and religion as technologies that we can ascribe to. You know, they're there, they exist for us, we try to evaluate them, we pick and choose. But all these spiritualities have evolved in a historical time frame. And the question is, what is the historical time frame asking of spirituality, asking of us today? And I think it's an interesting question because people often react to that as, really? You can't make up a spirituality, right? We have this sense of compartmentalizing, like spirituality is something that's like ontologically existing for, you know, and someone discovered it, right? But really, they are creations of human collectives and their experience in historical moments in time. So we see this happening. I'm not the only one that's bringing up this question. We see it happening in terms of the religion that's not a religion, in John Vervaeke's work, and some of these other people who are pursuing this question. I want to tag it on, you know, just to be completely transparent about what is arising in me, is I also want to tag it onto a couple of things that's been happening in the space. The conversation that Jared had with Aubrey last week around the distinctions between Sutra and Tantra, conversations I've been having with Tom Murray and John Churchill, who is a student of Dan Brown's, conversations with people in the Monastic Academy, and the recent book by Evan Thompson, Why I Am Not a Buddhist. And somehow in my mind, these are all percolating in this constellating this movement toward becoming more intentional about this question of what is the spirituality we need, and trying to catalyze that somehow. Now, of course, I think this question deserves a little more time and attention than a 1-hour Stoa session, or maybe we could do 3 or 4 in a row. But this, on the other hand, I think it doesn't need so much gravitas. You know, this question doesn't need to live in an institution or be sequestered in behind the hallowed halls of a monastery. I think that, and another thing, I was talking to someone the other day about collective insight practice, doing an interview, and I noticed that I had switched in terms of my whole orientation to that, like collective insight practice. These practices usually go over 2.5 days on a weekend. They're very intensive. And I was starting to think now of all the changes in all the collective intelligence we have around these practices now. And I'm starting to think that these practices should be less like programs and more like apps, more like one-offs, more like these kinds of things in the Stoa. I mean, they could lead to deeper engagements, but I think you could do a lot more with kind of building skills like we've been doing here in the Stoa, these little skill building things. So all of this is kind of in this question of the spirituality we need today. And I just wanted to outline it, and then maybe I wanted to do an exercise. Now the exercise I want to do, I have never actually done it before. So I want you to be very non-judgmental about it. And what I mean by that is not have any framework like what's the right answer, or I did the wrong thing, or I'm going to discover something that's in the wrong direction. This is not an exercise that has that kind of pointing out, you know, like I know what I'm pointing out kind of thing. So, so that's what we'll do today. So first of all, I think we need to have a working definition of spirituality, and one that is quite robust. And so I laid this out in a video on the Integral Stage. So if you want to see the whole thing, you can. It's a pretty short video. But what I mean by spirituality is a set of commitments. And what I mean by commitments are not necessarily conscious all the time, okay? So the set of commitments are ontological. So what is the world? Like what do we commit to what we believe about the world? They are epistemological. What is our ultimate understanding of how we know things? How are we going to relate to that? They're axiological, which means morals and ethics, and they're metaphysical. So you can take any spirituality and you can, identify it by these commitments, the foundational commitments that we make. And so these questions then become, what are the commitments we need to make in these 4 areas for the spirituality we need? Now, just to give you, give you a little how I answer some of that, and then we'll do the exercise. So an ontological commitment, for example, is the world really real? So Bhaskar said that we should commit to ontological realism, which is not naive realism. Naive realism is what you think about the world is the way the world is. But ontological realism means there's something about the world that exists without our human interaction with it. That his term was intransient, that the world goes on if it's not perceived and interacted with by humans. So this gives a sense that it's in distinction to that the world is completely Maya, or the world is an illusion, or the world is just phenomenologically arising in my attention, or something like that. Or the world is this this theater of trial and error and choice for you to work off original sin and go to heaven. So these are all ontological commitments. Like, what is this world? And I think that for the spirituality we need today, we need a commitment to ontological realism, because it's the only kind of commitment, I believe, that will ground us in protecting the earth. If we are subtly holding that it's not real, then this is not where our intention will go. So again, I'm not saying this is the ultimate ontological commitment for all time. I'm saying that we can fashion the spirituality we need around the ontological commitment that we seem to need today. So just hold that I'm very serious about that commitment, but I'm also serious about the choice for that commitment, and that other ontological commitments arise in other historical contexts. And holding what I just said means I'm also committed to epistemic relativism. And these two, Roy Bhaskar wrote a lot about how they actually serve each other. That if you just have epistemic relativism, there's all kinds of problems. If you only have ontological realism, you have, fights over your reality. But if you can hold these two together, they serve each other. And epistemic relativism is a commitment to not only the partiality of what we can know, right? So we committed that what we know is partial truth. So that's been stated elsewhere by Wilbur, let's say. But there's a back end to that, and that is that all partial truths are wholly valid in their context. So they're not just, so they're partial truths, and we tend to then think of, well, they're not very valid because they're partial. So you have to hold these two commitments, I think, in epistemic relativism at once, that all truths are partial, but they're 100% true in their context, which is just a piece. And this makes us much more compassionate with people who are from a certain context and they're just speaking their truth. And you're like, oh, that's true, but partial. You see the difference? So I'm trying to make a point here about what epistemic relativism means. It's not just, oh yes, but that's partial. When we say that, we say it from a vantage point as if we can tell it's partial because we have a higher truth. We have more of the truth, right? This is the way people have been using that phrase forever. So one of the things you can do in the spirituality is to investigate, this is a whole truth arising in front of me. How can I see the context more clearly, and then come from that context to help or to support or to whatever, participate. So I think that's an important kind of reframe for epistemic relativism. It's not as trivial as a lot of people have taken that statement in the past. So the third one, axiological, means ethics and morals. And Bhaskar had this notion of what he called judgmental rationalism, that we should use judgmental rationalism to evaluate morals and ethics. And I think that we need to push that further. I think it's a good starting point, but for me, the spirituality we need is something a little different than that. And so I want to call it, instead of judgment, because judgment has this hard cut to it, I want to turn the word into evaluative. So we're always evaluating across a spectrum of values, or so it's different than judgment. And what I mean is the distinction Kant made between rational judgment and aesthetic judgment. So when we look at beautiful artwork, our eyes are moving and we can feel that we're making some kind of evaluative experience. You like this yellow and then you're moving, but it's not a judgment unless you're an art critic, right? So aesthetic judgment, I'm calling evaluative, and the capacity to be evaluative. Now, instead of, so Bhaskar called it judgmental rationalism. And I think rational is also, we need to push beyond rationalism. It's too categorical. And I think we can push that into this notion of reasonableness. So an axiology of evaluative reasonableness. And the word reasonable really evokes a whole different stance toward judgment, let's say, or evaluation. Because I can, for example, I used this example the other day. It's kind of, it was a little bit of a trigger for the people I was talking to. So I just gave you a trigger warning. You see how I put a trigger warning in there without saying trigger warning? Okay, so for example, there have been something like a 500% increase in gun purchases in the US since COVID, right? So I can actually, I can see the reasonableness of wanting to go out in the climate of the US and get a gun. I can really lean into that. I can lean into it. I actually thought about it myself, you know? So, but I can evaluate it as less or more reasonable than something else. But I can enter the context in which it's reasonable. And the truth is, it's not rational to go out and get a gun to protect you from the government, let's say. It's completely irrational. Your gun is not gonna, no match for the military. But I can understand the reasonableness of it in a certain context. And then I can evaluate that across other reasonableness, right? So we can move from trying to evaluate and judge rationally. You can't evaluate and judge, for example, the information ecology around COVID, but you can do some evaluation of the reasonableness of certain choices, let's say. So it kind of is a posture that I think creates a lot more affordances, a lot more, I haven't examined this work from a critical stance. I'm still kind of in the honeymoon period. So, but I think that shift from judgmental rationalism to evaluative reasonableness is part of our commitment to the spirituality we need. And maybe has a great little puppy, and I love puppies, and now I get distracted. Okay, so this is kind of like, I'm just showing you the kind of methodology that a community could sit in and start to have, start to co-create this, this spirituality we need around these kind of geeky bones. Now, those are pretty easy. The last one are metaphysical commitments. And this is where we're going to do this untried exercise. And then maybe we'll talk about the exercise, and then I'll get into where this spirituality we need goes in terms of metaphysical commitments. Instead, this one's quite complex. So, just for a moment, take a meditation posture or just relax. We are going to go, this is the easiest level of meditation ever. That's all we need for this exercise. And that is just to pay attention to your thoughts. Let your thoughts come and pay attention to your thoughts, or pay attention to whatever's arising. And if it's thoughts, that's good, because we just want to experience what our attention, what is the capacity of attention? What is the quality of attending to inner experience? So it could be any inner experience in this case. Yeah, so if you have attention, what somebody said, too bad I have literal attention deficit disorder, but you can still experience your attention as being frenetic or frantic or whatever that experience is, that yes, this is how my attention works. We just want to get in touch with what we call attention, just that word. And as you're doing that, you can put in the chat room, what are some of the qualities, or how do you recognize it as attention? So for example, I noticed that it skips. I can go here, I can go there. It has that. It foregrounds, good. These are all, doesn't matter what we say, but by using a word, we know what that attentional system is. This is what we're in touch with. These are all great noticing. That's great that there's, yeah, maybe great. That's I would say Vervaeke's what is it called? Realization salience is the attentional system for him. I'm just trying to bracket what we call the attentional system. Relevance realization. Thank you. That would be his word. The attention system brackets, right? Okay, good. Now, so that was, the purpose of that is I'm not interested in the attention system, right? So the purpose of getting in touch with it is because that's not what this exercise I'm going to ask you to do. That's not where I want you to go. Okay, does that make sense? So now that you know, okay, you've got this, I want, the purpose of that is that we're not interested in that. And now we're going to spend 10 minutes. I want you to where is your will? And get in touch with that. Now, notice I'm not asking you to pay attention to your will. Yeah, so there's something like, that's a nice distinction. That we're like, you feel the difference when I said that, this sense of not paying attention to your will. Okay, let's see if anybody wants to share some of this experience. And I'm very curious to see how you would language or speak from this experience. As I said, I haven't actually done this before.
Good morning. This feels a lot like my meditation practice a la Eckhart Tolle, which is the renunciation of thought, presence, and can be very, like, my inner dialogue has just been plaguing me. So this presence practice is just getting into my body, and there's that stillness there and detachment. So when you were looking at, like, where is my attention, it was like ping, 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 and I feel like I could really direct it. And then my will just felt like an energy field coming through my body, but much outside of my body. And I can, thanks to this ongoing practice, I can excuse myself from thought pretty easily. How long I can stay there is something I'm growing. So when you said, where is your will? I just switched to the stillness and just sort of undulated there.
Yeah, see, I wasn't sure if the word will was going to work, but I didn't want something that preloaded your experience either. So that was great feedback. Thank you.
In my experience, I was noticing that, like,
where is your will? Was that the question?
Yeah, or, you know, it was hard to, the prompt was hard to figure out. But yeah, where is, or, you know.
Well, I was looking for my will or trying to find that in my experience. And then I found that very like act of looking for it, that felt like my will to me.
Ah. But then you said it was in your gut.
Yes.
Right. And so when you were with it in your gut and you stopped looking, that, what was that like? See, to look for your will is pay attention to it. This is what I would say. So the question is, one, then you was, it's in my gut. Then so you stopped looking, and what was that like?
Yeah, that was like my just initial response to your prompt, and it just feels like a lot of energy. Like that would be like the easiest way to describe it without getting too technical about it. It just feels like this churning or this wanting to be directed somewhere. Feels a little uncomfortable, actually.
Yeah, yeah. So I am, you know, Rainey is saying this. Yeah, the prompt, where is it, actually engaged your attentional system, and then remember later I had to kind of try to reframe, don't attend to it. So I think the prompt was not perfect. So where is your will, or I could have said get in touch with your will, or something. It needs some improving, but yeah, it feels like energy and it feels uncomfortable. That I think is that's interesting. That I can resonate with that. What's uncomfortable about it? Like, what's the quality of the discomfort?
Ooh. Like intensity. Intensity. When I'm with it, it just feels like a lot, and that I want to point it and express it and do something with it. So it feels like, yeah, it's quite an intense sensation to sit with.
Yeah.
I noticed just now that I had been eating, and I feel like I'm like, what is Bonnitta talking about when she says will? Because there's like the impulses, and then there's like, oh, now I'm being watched. So I started like noticing impulses with to suppress impulses. And like, is that my will, or is it the original impulse? It's like, yeah. Um, yeah, it feels like it's coming from a lot of different places.
It's a metaphor you'd use, like an image or something.
Well, it feels like there's control. Um, a tiger came up.
Ah,
Yeah. There's almost like this fierce energy. Like, yeah, when you're talking about energy, like I felt this sense of animal, like especially my eyes.
Yeah. Ferociousness.
Mm-hmm.
you two are going to enjoy your day.
Good chance. Hmm.
There's something about the inquiry that initially brought to mind all of my wants, things that I want, and what. And then it immediately went to this sort of will that doesn't originate in me. It feels more like a life drive, like a drive that's sort of living through me. And just, it's really curious how I don't identify it as my own, but yet it is in me. And yeah, I don't know really what to say.
No, that's beautiful. This is, you're channeling Schopenhauer. He said, I can will what I want, but I can't will that I will. It comes through me. And this is, I think, the intensity and the tigerness of it. It's continuous with the energy of the universe, right? And when you touch base with it, that's that intensity, or it's not me and it's intense, or it's not sourced by me.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had this kind of, I guess, like imagery that came with it of, my attention was like, thoughts were like these like kind of bubbles that kind of would expand and contract, and it felt, for me, I was feeling like will was the, like at the edges, the space in between, and kind of could push or contract away, and but there was all these different bubbles, so it was in the space between, but it wasn't a thing itself, in the same way that these bubbles of thought or like the attention was.
Yeah, I felt similar to a few of the last shares. The first one, I didn't take as much as attention as the inner experience. So I kind of landed in a space of stillness. And then when you first asked, where's my will? There was like kind of an empty, just a feeling of awareness. So it was like really, whoa, where is it? Where did it go? Is there no will? And then there's a kind of feeling of like an embodied feeling of the hara, like really moving towards something. And then I kind of wasn't satisfied with that. I just stayed with that for a bit. And then I started like, thinking about how I, some work I have to do or some problem I have with someone. And then that I could kind of see the whole will to, I like what people said about wants and goals. Like I kind of generated a want and then I was solving it. I was like in problem solving mode. And then a lot of activities came up. And they were kind of maybe a little bit like JJ was talking about, those thought clouds or something. They were kind of go and then they would extinguish and then I'd be back in awareness.
For me, the experience was very different from what I anticipated. I thought I would feel it in my gut, but I really felt most of it around my neck and my upper shoulder space. And metaphorically, it was almost as if there was possible extensions, octopus-like perhaps, or multiple hands and possibilities of doing things. It's almost as if the two hands were not enough and there were other ways of moving around, and sort of moving and sort of having this multi-dimensional perspective on things.
Yeah, for me, that's very interesting. So for me, if I if I ask the question in an open-ended way, I experience it more like Donna and other people were talking about, that it drops me, you know, I feel weighty, it drops me into my lower chakras. It feels like if I could have the capacity to open, the whole force of the universe could express itself through me, this intensity builds. But what you just described, I'm also aware of, and that is this sense of very directed will. I mean, there's times when I've taken that energy and I've stared down, like, which is like, I have a perceptual experience of a vortex. And it's like that energy's come up and it's like a steel blade. And that's when it comes from, for me, like from here, you know, this posture, you would say. So I would say, yes, that's in the same domain. It's interesting that you brought it up as different quality. Now, I'm not saying that's how you experienced it, but I was trying to remember what that feels like when the power's in this area.
Yeah, since you mentioned the steel blade, like if I had to use a martial arts metaphor, it was almost as if one had like potentially like Japanese swords, and the ability to maneuver them was not linear though. It was multidimensional and it was completely spherical. I mean, even my hands are moving in that manner right now. So it's almost as if the hand was not the constraint point on the sword, and it was free enough that one could cover the entire 360-degree spectrum.
Anything else? So that was very helpful. Thank you. And so now I'm going to tell a story that is a horribly bastardized narrative about Buddhist metaphysics. So yeah, I'm not a Buddhologist, but just to give it some kind of sense of the spirituality we need and put it in a context. So, you know, so again, believe me, this is a story. It's a story, a parable. Take it more as a metaphor. But, you know, if we can imagine the Buddha he grew up in a mythological culture. And what he discovered was something very, very ingenious. And he discovered that that there was causal links between different ways that you could react to phenomena or situations that created suffering, right? He basically came up with if-then thinking in the cycle of suffering. So instead of just, I'm destined to be a slave by some kind of permanent laws of the universe, or I'm destined to be born with original sin because some eschatological order of God, he said, no, we can examine this scientifically and see that there's causal links. So I think there's 13 causal links and if you break any one of those links, you break the chain of causality. So we see actually this notion of the causality of human experience actually arising for the first time. And you see causality also, if-then thinking, coming in the Western world with Plato, and you know, this is a structure in the mental structure of consciousness. So so that was very interesting. And then you could say that the next event, or the second turning, was around Nagarjuna's time. And what they discovered then, in terms of causality, is that mental models and words and concepts, even though they were virtual and illusory, they had real causal effects in the world, right? So I could be a paranoid, be delusionally paranoid that you're going to kill me, and that's completely an illusion, right? It's not real. It's a real illusion, but it's not. It's an illusion. But it'll change my behavior such that I can go get a gun and kill you, and that's a real effect in the world. So this notion of that causality, that illusions in your mind or virtual experiences could have real causal implications in the real world, was a another major milepost. And so in human consciousness, and this created then most of the traditions that spend all our time with the attentional system, right? So Vipassana, okay? We spend all our time with the attentional system, and there's a lot of benefit for that. But one of the problems with starting with the attentional system is that you start with phenomena that are already objects in your mind. And that has some benefits and some limitations. So I think the spirituality we need has to work with the intentional system. And we need a metaphysics of experience that starts with will and intention. What would those practices be like? Now, I know that this parallels some of Tantra, but I think most of that work is horribly saturated with the attentional system also. So this is part of my way of getting into moving from the metaphysics of the phenomenon, the phenomenal objects that are already objects in your mind. So it's kind of funny. See, that injunction says, let's start with objects in your mind. Let's pursue them to the end. You'll find they're empty. Of course they're empty, because you started with objects in your mind. I mean, it's kind of like a tautology, you know? Let's start with something. And this was Hartshorne's critique of Nagarjuna, basically in a nutshell. And so the question is, we need a metaphysics of experience that starts with intention, the intentional system, because it too traces back into the natural real world, as some of you said, like a tiger. You're not going to see in the tiger phenomenon arising in the tiger's mind, objects in the tiger's mind. So you, if you create your spirituality around that, then you'll feel separate. But if you create your spirituality around intention and will, you'll see. Somebody noticed the bird song, the swallows fledged this morning. And the little birds, like, this is the first time they're flying. There's 5 tiny little swallows, and they're so ecstatic. So I can see that in me, and I can see me in them. I'm not gonna, you know, I don't have the same kind of separation. So that I would argue that that's a move toward the metaphysics of experience for the spirituality we need today. Now, when Nagarjuna and his tribe discovered that mental, mental objects were causally implicated in the real world, this is something that is of huge benefit. But I think it stops short of what we need today. And I think that tags back to Peter's question, you know, what is, how can I be strong enough to lead a fulfilled life? And this notion of strong and fulfillment, I think, is in the intentional system. Are there any comments? I don't have a lot to say about it because this is something I'm just starting to work on.
Yeah, I would like to say something. I just think like in some ways this feels to me like some of the things we have already had in this course was more profound than this division. At least there's some things we have had I cannot see fit into this, and in particular I'm thinking about the story part, because for me I think that a story is like both ontology and epistemology thingy and metaphysics, and actually all four of them. So for me, as like we are understanding true stories, so for me it's like a basic category that cannot be put into one of those four. Yeah, so if you can speak to that.
Yeah, no, that's actually ends up where my paper ended up. What I've written so far is that if you have these set of commitments, then there's many stories that can reflect them. So this allows us then to have a spirituality where there's parables and there's myths and there's stories that reflect the same set of commitments, and that aren't competing or working against those commitments. So I want a spirituality that allows then, just like you all had different ways of expressing your intention, your will, that the way they're enstoried now is liberated, because we're very clear on our set of commitments. And these stories will come through different cultures, different group experiences, different mimetic tribes, different languages, and we don't have to fight about that, because we're always coming back to examining these fundamental commitments, and they will also change. I mean, do they change? Is this, no longer, I mean, the way things change now, maybe by, the end of the year, these aren't even, is it even the spirituality we need anymore, but the stories that I want to liberate the ability to tell many stories and story them from the same spirituality. I don't know if that's where you're going, but that's how it overlaps with stories for me.
Well, I guess that for me it's like when you say that these four are like the fundamental commitments, it's like there's a hierarchy, and then it's like story is at a lower point of the hierarchy, and that is where I think the conflict arises for me, because I feel like the story also owns me. The story owns me. So I live in stories. Like I cannot see outside of my narratives. I feel so. Therefore, I just I cannot separate the story from the other things.
Yeah, it's interesting context. Yeah, so there's a tension between what I'm getting at and that experience. I would say yes. That's interesting.
I've sort of missed the last little chunk of conversation that you had because I was in the chat. And what you were talking about around will and that experience and the meditation or the practice that observes a will is feeling it's hitting something. I sort of jokingly, but not really, wrote BDSM into the chat. And even before that, I thought of contact improvisation, which is something I've been doing for a long time, because it felt like there was something really important there around, like historically, I feel that us humans have been learned to repress our will, our even our awareness of our own will, as a way to control the masses. And a lot of that's even, like, you see that in the repression of sexual energy. And so these practices like BDSM and even contact improv, which is not explicitly sexual, is really tracking those that, what moves us.
Yeah, so that was Freud's argument. He said that all civilizations are founded on the suppression of the will. So now we have an interesting question. If we are the council from, the council from the advanced world to create a new spirituality for the humans, right? Because now the question is, if we have this spirituality, can we have civilization as we know it? And I would say no. I think we need to let that whole trajectory die. And so that's an interesting question. I mean, I kind of overstated, made it a real big thing, but that's what you're sensing. What do we mean by civilization? It's this long arc of the expansion of geosocial space, more and more people under one cult object. Right now, the cult object is the market, finance, capitalism. So that's what we mean by civilization. It's grown, so there's more territory and more people under one, what George Herbert Mead called cult object or social object or social imaginary, whatever. So yes, so this notion of not wanting people to suffer, but releasing the long arc of civilization, I think is interwoven in this somehow.
There's something that's coming in for me about the attentional system and these practices that kind of like, it seems like are meant to obliterate it in some way. And I think about like, the attentional system helps us notice what's happening. And so if we obliterate the attentional system, then we don't notice what's happening on Earth. We don't notice what's happening, like it feels like you can start to fail to notice what's actually going on and that we need to act. And yeah, I relate to what Tanya said. I'm also a long-time practitioner of contact improvisation, and it has like changed the way that I feel myself and the way that I do my things. And so I really, I gravitate a lot toward this like intentionality that you're talking about and like harnessing the will. And I think there's this thing happening with a lot of these forums like this and other like podcasts and stuff that I'm listening to, that there's so much, like there's all this like thought machine that's happening around these things. And then I'm in these other places where I'm being exposed to like the Andean cosmovision, and I'm just like, wow, these people already have it mapped out. Like they got a map. And it is like, I wish to bridge the two, and because it's like there's like multiple steps ahead, and I see us like referencing a lot of European and Western thought, and it's like it feels like we're like grasping at something that is already happening.
Yeah, I would say we're using the wrong system for the, it's like a tool. The attentional system is one thing, and you're right, we need that. But then there's the intentional system, and almost all our focus, or the system we bring online to solve these problems, or is more of the attentional system. All the discourse around the virtuality of self and salience realization and perspective, this is all the attentional system. There's not.
The last thing that I wanted to say is that as far as like an intention goes, a lot of traditions put forward the intention of friendship and the intention of being a learner and always learning from your environment how to be a better friend. So that, I just put that out.
Okay, I know Andre is reminding us of intentionality. Is that the name of the book by Brentano? Is that the whole name of the book? Yeah.
It's part of Franz Brentano's writing. So he came up with the concept of intentionality, and then when Martin Heidegger wrote Being in Time, he used intentionality as a core part of it, and Edmund Husserl did as well. And that's where a lot of our current ontology stems from. If you go before that, it would be Immanuel Kant. But he was a bit more focused towards metaphysics rather than straight ontology.
Okay. Yeah. So this was rewarding work for me. Thank you. It was nice to have like a little participation around some of these questions, and yeah, lots to think about. Peter, what's coming up at the STOA?
What's coming up at the STOA is collective presencing in 1 hour with Rhea Beck. Recommend that. Socratic speed dating tonight, Dark STOA, same time as usual. And tomorrow we have Vince Horn is coming. He was here actually in the chat. He just had to leave though. And he's doing a session on social meditation. And when is that? That's at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So you can check that out on the website.
Okay, so the STOA is run by the gift economy. Your presence here has already been a gift to me and to each other. But if you wish to, stop it, Frady. I'm trying to be serious. I just got to get through this. If you wish to contribute more, you can do so at thestoa.ca/gift. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.